Again, we're in our Encounter series, and we've been looking kind of a series within a series. In this series, we've been talking about the three predictions that our Lord and Savior gave to his disciples. Today, we're looking at the third of the three predictions. This is where we pick up in verse 32 of chapter 10. So let's pick it up. It says this. They were on the road. The they is referring to Jesus and his disciples. They're going to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were astonished, but those who followed him were afraid. Taking the 12 aside, again, he began to tell them the things that would happen to him. So right here, what we got to first pick up, that we are in, again, the third prediction of Jesus. And there's been this progression on a few different fronts of what was taking place since the time. One of the progressions that we see is geographically. If you remember the first in Mark chapter 8, Jesus was in a place called Caesarea of Philippi. Caesarea of Philippi is equivalent to North Georgia. This is one of those places that unless you live there, you only go there if you are doing a retreat. You are intentionally trying to get away from people, human beings and individuals. And so they are in North Georgia. They are in Caesarea Philippi. Jews are not normally there. While they are there, Jesus tells them that the Son of Man must go back to Jerusalem. He must suffer, and he's going to die. And after 3 days, he will be resurrected, right? So far, we're nowhere near Jerusalem. They really don't get it, right? And they do it. The next prediction, they are now in a place called Capernaum. And in Capernaum, basically, it is kind of in Samaria. Well, it's not kind of, it is in Samaria. And so now Samaritans are basically kind of Jew-Gentile mix, that are there. And now they're a little closer to home, but they're still kind of in a distant land. Right here, we see in verse 32, it says, they were on the road going to Jerusalem. And so on this third, they are now on the road. It is starting to get real, right? They feel what is going on, and they are sensing it and they feel it. But not only do we see that geographically, they're getting closer to this, but we also see audibly that Christ is getting a lot more detailed in his account of what he's been saying to them. And so it says this in verse 33, it says, see, Jesus is referring, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him, and he will rise after 3 days. And so first we see physically. We first was in North Georgia. Now we're in Atlanta. We are here in the city. It's becoming real. But he's getting more even detailed in his account. One of the things that he says again, right? He's like, this is not the first time that he said, and this is actually recorded the third time, but we even know that there was even multiple more times that Jesus has probably already brought this to their attention. But in here, the first thing that he says, see, I want you to recognize that we are now on the road. You can see Jerusalem up ahead. This thing is real, right? And then not only does he do that, he goes, we are going up to Jerusalem. If you've studied and you've been paying attention to the other previous accounts, one of the things that you see is that he's moved from the first person singular to the first person plural. In the first two accounts, he says, the Son, I must go back to Jerusalem. I must suffer and I must die. But now we go from I to we. And then it's like, wait, Jesus. We. What's this we stuff that we're talking? And so that must have already brought kind of this shock to it. But then he goes into even a more specific account. And remember, in the first account, he says that the Son of Man must go. He must suffer, he must die, and he will be raised. That's in Mark chapter 8. Now, he gets a lot more explicit in what's going on. And what we see is that Jesus declares that the chief priests, he adds a little detail these chief priests and the scribes, they're going to condemn him to death. But the disciples recognize and understand that even though they're condemning him, they really have no authority to do anything with him. It's sort of like if one of your siblings say, I'm going to get you, I'm going to, and, on one end, they're going to kill you, or they're going to be like, okay, I can take you, right? There's not really. But then if your parents or the authorities come in and say, I'm going to get you, then there's a little difference to it. There's a little bit more weight. And so on here, he says, listen, the chief priests, they're going to condemn us to death. But then what they're going to do, because we know that the chief priests can't really execute any type of judgment or any type of punishment. What they're going to do is that they're going to hand you over. They're going to hand me over to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are the ones who are actually going to follow it out. And what the Gentiles are going to do, what he first said in the other passages, is that they're gonna suffer. But what he says right here is not just leaving in the general and generic suffering. He's more detailed. He says they are going to mock me, they're going to spit on me, they're going to flog me, and they're going to kill me. That there is a very detailed account, and basically there's like, this is getting real. This is no more of just kind of play, imaginary, that there's specifics, and it's so much that you can feel it. It's kind of like you're seeing this take place, and it's now coming in 3D. You are on the road. You can see what's about to happen, and this is very specifically what's about to take place. This is getting real. Ultimately, what Jesus is saying is that we must be prepared, or we must be ready to embrace the certainty of the cross. We must embrace. He's been saying it from the beginning. If you want to follow me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And he said that over and over and over again. But he's saying there's a certainty that must come from it. Because in doing and embracing this certainty, it begins to play all types of tricks in your mind, because you're like, it's getting real. It's sort of like that time where you was like, when I'm about to graduate and, I'm going to college to graduate, and then this is like 4 years from now. For some of us, it's 6. It's just like, but we're going to graduate someday, and it's like in the distant future. But then when you get to that, your junior year, your senior year, and then you get to that last semester, you're just like, oh, this is real. What's going to happen once I'm done? And it's like real. You really feel it, and you're just like, all right. And you start getting a little different. This is what's going on, is that they're embracing the certainty of the cross. This is what we do from the very beginning. It's like we get saved, and Jesus says, if you want to follow me, take up your cross, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. But what we do in the Christian life is that we spend the rest of our days trying to figure out how serious he was about those commands. Now, when he said deny yourself, what does he really mean? When he said that whole take up your cross thing, was that serious? We spend most of our time trying to figure out how serious he is about this, because we don't want to be too fanatical for Jesus. It don't take all of that, right? Right? And so we spend a lot of our time trying to talk ourselves off of just this concept of what Jesus said so explicit: deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. He's very clear at what he's called us to be. And a lot of it comes out of this posture. And as these disciples are in wrestling with the certainty of the cross, there's 4 responses that I see that Peter, or that Mark, is wanting us to see. He doesn't explicitly say it, but I think you're to look at what's going on to see the 4 different. The first one is that you see kind of the humble nature, the humble posture of Christ. That you see him taking his position, and he is the very beginning. As they're going to Jerusalem, it says that Jesus was walking ahead of them. And so here's Jesus walking ahead of the front of the crowd, and they're going to Jerusalem. His imminent death is coming. And he's just kind of like walking in humility, recognizing that this is just the lot that God has given me. Right? And then you got the people in the back. It says the disciples, some of them, they were the second group was astonished. There's this second tier group of kind of apostles, disciples, was like, they were just astonished. Or another word is, they were amazed. man, he's up there kind of leading the pack, walking to his destiny. Does he know? Like, he's been telling us, so I know he knows, but he's walking into death, being flogged, being persecuted. He's walking into that reality. He's embracing it, and they're astonished. But then there's another group of disciples that he says, and the other disciples, they're just back there just like, man, I'm just being honest, I'm just scared. I don't know what to do with this. He's about to die. I don't know what's going to happen to us. And there's just like this whole tension that is going on. So on one, Jesus is embracing his humanity, embracing his lot in life. Then you got the other people who are amazed that Jesus is walking with such boldness and confidence as he takes his life. And then there's a group of people who's like, I'm just afraid. It's like when mom and dad are arguing. You're just like, can y'all just stop? Like, I don't know what to do. This is too much, right? And so there's these three responses that are taking place. And then once we begin to get in fear, if you're not willing to confess your fear, you know what you end up doing? You begin to get anxious. And we know when you get anxious, you know what you begin to do? You begin to start controlling things because you don't want to be anxious, right? And so people who are not willing to embrace their fear, what they end up doing is trying to control everybody else or control their environment so they can get out of their fear. I don't want to have to deal with my fear, so I'll control you or control my environment so I don't have to deal with my fear. And so this is what the typical response ends up doing, is that the disciples take on this response. They've tired of saying, all right, we tried to rebuke him when he was talking about this dead thing. That didn't work. We tried to, talk about something else. That didn't work. All right, so let's just embrace. Let me just figure this out. What's going to happen to me, right? And so in here, basically, as they begin to embrace the certainty of the cross, their concern is not really or primarily about what's going to happen to Christ. It's more about what's going to happen to them. And you see the disciples begin to make their move. There's this power play, right? And what he is ultimately telling us is that Mark is saying, in the midst of these times, beware of your selfishness. Beware of your selfish ambition. Because we see James and John, the sons of Zebedee, in verse 35, approached him and said, Teacher, let me big up you first. We want you to do wherever we want you to do, whatever we ask of you. Will you do it? Right? When you go and ask someone, it says, before you say no, let me, and you just kind of go and you kind of butter them up. And it says, I know you're going to say no, but you can't say no. And then they want you to commit before they even ask you what you're committing to. Right? They just said, all right. And it's kind of like this idea that he says James and John. And what's unique about that, he says the sons of Zebedee. James and John was basically Jesus's mother's sister's children. Matthew goes in and basically says that, hey, it was their mother who put them up to this, right? Them asking this question. Mark is like, I'm not letting you off the hook. Yeah, your mother may have introduced the topic to you, but you fully embraced and ran with that thing, right? And so he basically comes and he says to them, give us whatever we want. Jesus, playing along with them, says, all right, let's go. I'll go here with you. What do you want? What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. And they answered him, allow us to sit at your right and at your left in your glory. Right? You see, right now they still have the image of Jesus as the conquering king. Remember, there's this tension that he's been going that you are the Messiah. And where we're willing to embrace him as conquering king, it's this suffering servant thing that we're having problems with. But he says, all right, you keep talking about the suffering servant thing. We can't talk you out of it. So we'll just roll with you because we ain't got nowhere else to go. So we're going to roll with you. But let's get back to this conquering king thing. And he gives them, and they begin to fight for a position and kind of their heart's posture. And so what they're saying was like, hey, since we family, not like family like everybody else, like we family, right? When you start saying it multiple times, that kind of, we family, like family, right? And so they're basically says, since we're family, and like in the real sense of family, hey, here's kind of what we were thinking. Mom told us to say this. Here's what we're thinking. why don't you let us sit at the right and the left? The position of the right was the person who was second in charge. The left was the person who would be third in charge. And there was this like, since you're going to be this conquering king, we don't understand the suffering servant, but the conquering king, since this is going to happen, can I sit at the right and I sit at the left? Can we work that out? And so they began to make their power play, their power move, based upon their ambition. And then basically Jesus was like, all right, yeah, you don't know what you're asking. You don't really know what you are asking for. And then he goes on and says, are you able to drink the cup? Are you able to drink the cup or to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? It's like, are you able? And so right here, Jesus takes these two symbols that are clearly, that they know exactly what Jesus was talking about, because the cup in the Old Testament or throughout Scripture represents kind of this idea of, this metaphor of an individual's fate, right? This is the fate of an individual. In Psalm 16, the psalmist credit the Lord for assigning his portion or cup. Psalm 23, he equates the abundant life as this idea of an overflowing cup, the cup that overfloweth. It's kind of like your destiny, your faith. And so Jesus is asking, are you willing to accept this cup, this idea of this suffering that I'm about to endure? Are you willing to be baptized with the baptism that I'm about to be baptized with? And that word in baptism was like, are you willing to identify with me? Are you willing to literally, like it's simple, go under with me and die with me? Right? And they're probably like, yeah, does that get us the whole right and the left thing? If it does, then yeah, I'm with it. Let's do it. Right? And so they begin to so they prematurely, without even counting the cost, they just kind of go and say, yeah, I'm with you. Verse 39, we are able, they told him. And Jesus said, all right, you will drink the cup that I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. He says, however, but to sit at my right and my left is not mine to give. Instead, it is for those whom it has been prepared. He says, you will, if you follow me, you will and you must embrace your identity as the suffering servant. That is a non-negotiable for those who are following me. You will embrace it. You will take on this posture. But he says, the place of honor, the place of power that you seek after, that's not for me to give. That's for my Father to give. Right? And so he affirms one, but on the flip side, he says, listen, but that's not my place. And so now, you just kind of like, the gallery comes in. You know, you and I come in because we are not as bold as John and James, because we ain't family. We are not as bold as them. And so we come in and the other 10 see what's going on, and they just and they get mad. In verse 41, when the 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. Why were the disciples so indignant? That word indignant, they said they had the same anger intensity that Jesus had when the disciples were denying the children. It says with that same tenacity, that same frustration, they began to be mad at John and James. Why? Because they trying to leverage the fact that they family. And I don't like that. Remember, we just had the conversation about who's the greatest, and we already determined that you weren't it. We had that talk, and now there's this tension, and they're wrestling with this. And so how do I know that they were not mad just because they tried to make the power play? They were more mad that, oh man, that should have been me. That was the play that I should have made, and they beat me to it. Right? And so their biggest concern is not, again, what was going to happen to Jesus. Their biggest concern was what was going to happen to them in light of what was going to happen to Jesus. And so he brings this idea up, and he says, and Jesus, listen, y'all. We must understand that I think you want this position. But one of my mentors, Dr. Crawford Loritz, used to always tell us, he says, don't ever allow your giftedness to take you to a place where your character can't keep you. Don't allow it, you see, because a lot of us, you think that you want this position, you think you want this title, you think you want this, but see, the problem is that if you get it, you'll mess it all up. Because your character, you're not ready to get this position. You're not ready. Your character is not there. You think you want to be top dog, but you're not ready to be there. You see, what Jesus is not arguing, he doesn't rebuke them for wanting position or even want that. The rebuke is not there. Jesus is not even talking about like this idea of passivity. Every time you see Jesus in the book of Mark, he is taking on his position of authority by the fact that he's walking in front of them. That was the place of the scribes, or the place of the rabbinical, the priests that would be during those times. They would walk in front. When he sat down to teach, that he was putting himself in position. So he's not against point leadership, but what he's saying is that what are we leveraging our point leadership for? Are we leveraging it for ourselves? Are we leveraging it for the benefit of others? And so ultimately, Jesus is saying that if you want to be a leader, you must proactively serve others. You must be proactive in serving others. Remember, we talked about leadership is proactively meeting the needs of others. Jesus is calling his disciples to focus on their present service over their future status or honor. And so he goes in verse 42, he says, Jesus called them. He says, listen, this is not just the James and John problem. Let's everybody come in, bring it in. And he said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. He basically says, you know how leadership works. He says the problem is that your leadership philosophy is dipped in kind of this worldly mindset. It's the same worldly mindset that I rebuked Peter for back in the day when he was just like, I told him I was going to suffer and die, and he was just like, this is not a good plan, Jesus. And I said, get behind me, Satan, because you're thinking like the world, right? Because you think self-preservation is God's will for your life. He was like, get behind me. It's the same way now. He says, you guys know. You guys are thinking about leadership in the way the world thinks about leadership. That's not how you should think about leadership. Again, he doesn't say you shouldn't think about being a leader. He says, but it's how we think about leadership. What is your posture as you're engaging and as you're thinking about leadership? He says, you know how they regard it. They regarded as rulers of the Gentiles. And in there you see this position that he uses these two words. One has to do with the position. These are Gentile rulers, and they lord over. They do it for their self-interest. And what they end up becoming is that it says that those in high positions act as tyrants. They use their leadership position for self-service. And he goes on and he says in verse 43, but it is not so among you. There is a worldly way that we do leadership, but that's not the way God's people do leadership. That's not the way that we do leadership, right? He said there's actually another way, and he says, on the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant. So let's first deal with the position. If you want to be great, you must take on the identity of a doulos. We've talked about that already. You must become a bondservant. You must embrace. Don't think of leadership in the way of being the conquering king. Think of leadership as the way of being a suffering servant. So, if you want to be great, be a servant. Right? And so they first deal with the identity. Now, we're not talking about doing servant-oriented things. We're talking about embracing the identity, your position of service, right? But then he goes on, and it says, and whoever wants to be first among you, you will be a slave to all. So you not only are you to embrace your identity as a willing bondservant, a slave, you must take that principle and that identity, not just for your children, not just for the people that you love, but you should do that and apply that principle to everybody you come into contact with. That's the requirements of greatness, of what it means to be a leader in my economy. So he pits these two together. Worldly leadership is one that is solely based upon authority, that uses their authority for their own selfish purpose and their selfish ambition. Godly leadership is taking on the form of a servant, and using your position for the benefit of other people. And so he's comparing and contrasting these two, and he's saying this is a totally different way that we need to do this. Why? What's the reason? He goes and he gives us verse 45. And verse 45 I believe, is the pinnacle of what the person and work of Jesus is about. That he says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Verse 45 says, for even the Son of Man. Right here he says, for the Son of Man. You remember me, the one who's the conquering king? The one who's the Messiah, the one that you confess that he is the Messiah, he is the one, you know him, the Son of Man. I'm not shrinking back from who I am. I am God in the flesh. I'm not shrinking back. Even me, the Son of Man, did not come to be served, but to serve. And that the imagery that is about to take place, that Jesus is going to flesh this out, is that, remember in John chapter 13, when the disciples, again, they're arguing again about who's the greatest. And as they're arguing about this, about who's the greatest, and they're at the table, the only one who is the Son of God gets up from the table, takes the apron, wraps it around himself, and begins to wash the feet. The only one who is deserving of his feet being washed takes on the posture of the lowliest of them and begins to wash all the disciples' feet. And so here he says, for the Son of Man, me, God, did not come to be served, but to serve. That's the very identity of who I am. I've embraced this identity. And then he gives that word, that connector word, that word and. And it says to give his life as a ransom for many. You know what that idea that of to give your life, the way we break ourselves out of the bondage of being so me-focused is by giving. Is that give. But he says he gives his life as a ransom. You know what a ransom is? A ransom is a price that is paid to release a slave. You see, what is the slavery? That we are all in bondage, but we're in bondage to our own self and self-interest. We love me some me. My favorite subject is me. When you're talking to other people, you know, after you're done talking about yourself, then the next thing you want to know is, I want to know what you think about me. Right? Because that's our favorite subject, is me. We are experts in me. Right? And so we see this idea of like the way that you give is by giving you to others. And Jesus modeled this as the very essence of the gospel, that God, that Christ gave himself as a ransom. And this is why Philippians chapter 2 says, he says, if there's any fellowship, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any peace, he says, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, the same spirit, by considering others more important than yourselves, taking on the form of a servant, a doulos, a bondservant, who, even though he was God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but instead he emptied himself. He willingly took off his robe for the purpose of serving, and he took on the form of death, the worst type of death. Why? So that we might be reconciled to God, so he can serve us. We had a problem. And our problem was a reconciliation problem. Our problem was we was detached from God. Our problem is that no matter how our greatest works, nothing that we can do to earn favor with God. Our problem was that there was a lack of intimacy and fellowship with our Maker. Our problem was we were lonely. That was what our problem was. And so Jesus, seeing this loneliness problem, he says, let me step in and live the life that they can't live, die the death that they deserve, so I can answer that problem and I can serve them. So when I come as the Son of Man, I'm not coming because I didn't have a problem. I'm eternally sitting with the Father. I don't have a problem. The problem is your problem, but I'm coming to solve your problem. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom, to help those who are bound to their own self-interests. They're bound, they're stuck to only focusing in on me. And so he says, we have a problem. The gospel, the person and work of Jesus is the good news that solves the problem that you and I have. And it's the greatest example that any leader could ever give. Because it's him paying the price to free us. I think this was so ingrained and embedded into the disciples and into the apostles that this began the very essence of what the message of what a life of Christ looks like after we recognize the gift that he has given us, that the rest of our life is a P.S. It's a thank you to what he has done for us. And so that's why we talk about the gospel changes people, and then we use all of our time, our talent, and treasures to help people meet Jesus, to experience his love in the context of the church, to live purposely in the context of their neighbors and their lives, that there's nothing greater. That Piper says it this way, he says, missions exist because worship doesn't. But it only comes when we truly understand what true heartfelt worship is like with Jesus. And it's that we're willing to embrace him both as conquering king, but as a suffering servant because we recognize it. And so I'm just going to end with 5 quick things that we see in all 3 of these books that are just talking about embracing our identity as a suffering servant. For us to stop playing church and to us to stop playing Christian and us to be and embrace the identity of who we are as Christ's servants. 5 takeaways. I'm going to walk through them quickly. Number 1 is this: a servant serves others even when it's inconvenient. It's not only when it's convenient. 1 Corinthians chapter 9:19, he says this: although I am free, this is Paul speaking, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. He says, listen, the bottom line is all things is permissible, but the greater question is all things profitable? So I'm going to inconvenience myself if it means the possibility of winning you over. Number 2, a servant serves even people that he or she dislikes. Let that sink in for a minute, right? It's not just I'm going to do it to the people I like. It's even the people I don't like, right? Because again, it's a slave to all, not the ones you like, but all. Romans 5:7, he says this: for rarely will someone die for just a person, though for a good person, perhaps someone might even dare to die. But it got that, but God demonstrates his own love towards us while we were still sinners. Christ died. Christ didn't say, hey man, get it together, and then I'll show you what it's like to be served. Christ just says, listen, I'm going to serve you. Why? Because I can't deny who I am. I am a conquering king, but I also am a suffering servant. And to deny it, it has nothing to do with how you're going to accept it or whether you reject it. I'm going to serve you because that's who I am. And I'm embracing who I am. Number 3, a servant serves even when he or she dislikes the work. So it's not just about when you like it or when you're going to get benefits from it.
It's about just doing and it's serving. 2 Corinthians chapter 5:13, Paul again says, for if we are out of our mind, it is for God. But if we are in our right mind, it is for you. And basically, this is what Paul is saying. He says, I became a slave to all. All things are permissible, but all things are not profitable. You see, the reality is this, that even though I can drink, even though I can eat pork and swine, even though, he says, to the Jew, I'll become like a Jew so that I may win Jews. Paul could have had all the pork chops he wanted. But he was just like, but when I'm with Jews who spent their whole life and been told that they can't eat pork chops, I'm not going to ever eat a pork chop in front of a Jew. Am I sinning if I did eat a pork chop? No. All things are permissible, but all things are not profitable. At the end of the day, it's about how am I being profitable for God's glory, because I have made myself a servant even when it's inconvenient. Yes. Can you drink? Yes. As long as you don't get drunk, you can drink all you want. But if you are around people who have problems and are struggling with alcoholism, then the Bible says don't ever drink again. Because it may be permissible, but is it profitable? Paul is saying, I have made myself a servant to all people, even when it's inconvenient to me. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about his glory. I love what we talk about. We said all things work together for the good. You see, but the reality is it's only good if you want to be like Christ. Things don't work together for the good for you if your final goal is not being like Christ. If your goal is a better life now, then that verse is not telling you the truth. It's not. All things work together for the good who want to be conformed to the image of Christ, who wants to embrace their identity as a suffering servant. That's who it works together for the good. Because we recognize even the worst of things, there's something that's working in me for his glory. Number 4, a servant serves even when he or she receives no personal satisfaction. You see, this is the problem that oftentimes that we want to serve those, but I'll serve you if you're able to serve me back. But the people who can't serve you back, I don't really want to mess with you like that, right? Because I'm serving so many people, so I got to be limited in who I'm serving, right? And so you end up serving those who serve you back. There's one key phrase that you got to learn. You need to tattoo it on your arm. You need to put it on your visor. Do whatever you need to do to put this. This phrase is learn how to ask this question. How can I help you? How can I help you? Those words will revolutionize how you walk. Because what you're doing is that when he says God basically mobilized all of himself so that we can live, what we're saying is what can I do to help you? You're saying that I'm going to take all of me, all of my resources, and all of the stuff that I have, all of who I am, for the sole purpose of helping you to accomplish what you need to accomplish. How can I help you? And so what Jesus is saying, that if you're going to be a leader and if you are a boss of people, then use your management, use your bossness to basically ask the question, how can I help you? How can I help you better do your job? It's not about how can you help me do my job. How can I help you? And you're just like, all right, yeah, I get that, Dhati. I recognize that, but that's a lot, especially if you're talking about being a slave to all. I can't do that for all. And that leads us to our 5th point. A servant serves that with an attitude of assisting another and enabling another. You don't do it begrudgingly or necessity, but you recognize. And there's this term that I don't know if it's coined, but Andy Stanley, I learned it from Andy Stanley, he calls it symbolic leadership. Symbolic leadership. And he's basically, the phrase is, do for one what you wish you can do for all.
Now, we recognize that even if you were here, that if you made this commitment, says, I want to be this, Lord, I want to do this, that even if just the people in this room, you couldn't say, how can I help you to everyone? That you have a capacity, that you have a limitation, you have a space you can't possibly do. But the recognition is that you do for one what you wish you can do for all. And it's the same way that I recognize that, being married and having 6 kids. We understood this principle really quick. You didn't have to tell me twice, right? Because the thought is the reality is that if I do something for one of my children, then I got to do it for all of my children. And then if we embrace that mentality, then we just couldn't do anything. Because it's hard to do everything for everyone all the time. And so what the principle of symbolic leadership is that you do for one what you wish you can do for everyone. But you allow this example to be the picture of what you are doing for all. You see what the beautiful thing of the gospel, the beautiful thing is that Jesus didn't have to do for one what he wished he can do for all. When Jesus gave his life as a ransom, he did for one what he could do for all. That when he died on the cross, his death, his substitutionary atonement wasn't something that just satisfied my sin and my punishment, but when he said Christ died once for all, the just for the unjust. And the reality is that we get a chance to mirror the person and work of Christ in our everyday lives of something that he did by giving his life as a ransom and by saying that he paid the price for all of us. That if anybody in here has put their confidence, put their trust in Christ's service to us, the fact that he died for us, that he paid the penalty for us so that we can solve the problem that we could not solve. That he did that not just for Dhati, he did that for you. He did that for every individual who is willing to accept his work and to be received. Why? Because he did not just take the position of a conquering king. That's the way the Gentiles do it. They just embrace that identity. And he says that you, as believers, you can't just accept that identity, but you also must accept the identity of a suffering servant. And if you don't embrace the identity of a suffering servant as one who is willing to sacrifice it all for the sake and the benefit of others, then you don't get the gospel. You're not living the gospel. It's something that you can intellectually may state, but you don't get it because that's the very core. And so when Jesus says, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's real easy for us to say it. It's a lot harder for us to embrace it.